Over the past few weeks, people in Bangladesh have witnessed a historic rebellion.
Tonight, celebration on the streets of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. Weeks of deadly protests ousting the country's prime minister from a decade and a half of rule.
Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has taken off in a military helicopter towards India to seek safe shelter. We've got multiple local and international media reporting that she has resigned.
It's unprecedented. I mean, the whole city is in the streets.
On August 5th, Bangladesh's Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, resigned, fled the country after 15 years in power. And many people in Dhaka, the capital, celebrated in the streets. And one of the students celebrating was Shima Akhtar. She's 23 and studies music at Dhaka University. Shima said that friends of hers were killed by the police in clashes that led up to the prime minister's resignation. Here she is speaking Bengali. In her words, she's saying, quote, "It felt like a war had begun. We had to hold our ground to save our brothers."
কিন্তু এই জেনারেশনটা যেটা হইছে এই জেনারেশনটা যে দেশের জন্য প্রাণ দিতে পারে সেটা পুরো জাতি জেনে গেছে আবার পুনরায় জেগে গেছে.
She goes on to say, quote, "Now the whole country knows that this generation is willing to die for the country. We have fully discovered our love for the country."
She was sort of so passionate when she spoke. She would show us her goosebumps, and she had these sort of quivering lips as she told us about what happened in the protests.
Karishma Mehrotra is a South Asia correspondent for The Post. She spoke with Shima on the street in Dhaka.
And she's also someone who, like many other students, wanted to see real structural change. And she was very adamant that if it didn't happen, she was ready to hit the streets again.
Not long after the prime minister resigned, Karishma went to Dhaka to witness this moment in Bangladesh. And as soon as she got off the plane, she saw the impact of the student revolution.
So what I saw right away was actually students sort of running the city. They were wearing their university badges and their donated neon vests, and they were holding sticks and they were directing traffic. And some of them were extremely young as 10 years old. And I didn't see any cops when I arrived at all. So I think a lot of people would probably look at that with a lot of horror. I think other people could look at it with a lot of inspiration. I was just amazed that it was a sight I never thought I would see before, a city literally run by students.
Those students have now worked with Bangladesh's military to form an interim government. But it's a delicate moment. Will these students be able to transform their big demands into real political change?
And so we're at this moment where they are so adamant that they want real reform. They want a new constitution. They want to see the politicization and the corruption in their institutions to go away. And the different ways that this could go is very unclear right now.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, August 21st. Today, I talk with Karishma about how student protesters led a revolution in Bangladesh and what comes next. So, Karishma, I want you to take me back and explain a little bit about how Bangladesh ended up in this situation. What led to these students protesting in the streets and essentially taking over their own government?
I think it was a lot of pent-up anger over a very long period of time. So Sheikh Hasina, the leader of Bangladesh, who has now fled the country, she has ruled Bangladesh in these recent 15 years, and she has been known as the Iron Lady.
Our people, well, they feel confident. Yes, they can have a better future. They can have a better life, and they expect that.
Initially, when she came in, there was a lot of hope surrounding her economically, democratically. The election that brought her in was analysts say, was a free and fair election in 2008. But increasingly, she left the institution super politicized, extremely corrupted. The Constitution was sort of amended again and again and again, and allowing elected leaders like her to abuse their power. So you were left with a country that every institution you can think of, the courts, the universities, the central bank, every aspect of Bangladeshi life was severely politicized and had so much corruption. And she became Bangladesh's longest serving leader despite that.
And what did that mean for the experiences in day-to-day life for young people in Bangladesh? Like when they saw the corruption, when they saw the fact that it seemed like their leader was not someone that they trusted, what did that mean for their lives?
I mean, I think the first visceral experience day to day is just the lack of freedoms, right? The lack of free media, the lack of freedom of speech, the lack of being able to say the things you want. But I think less day to day, but what increasingly happened was you had election after election that was not free and fair. Analysts say the last free and fair election was actually in 2008. And so you have 3 elections after that, including this last recent one, where the political opponents, the opposition, boycotted. So you sort of had this tightening of the ability to freely speak, to freely do your job, to not be politicized in a country that was so increasingly politicized. And so I think on top of that, to just not have free and fair elections meant it was bound to burst at some point.
And I've also seen in your reporting that there was an issue that came up about quotas in government jobs. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the role that that issue played in this wave of dissent?
Yeah, so what was interesting is that when Hasina was in her early years ruling, there was a lot of hope about the economy in Bangladesh, especially riding on the garment industry that was seen to be employing a lot of people, lifting people out of poverty. Bangladesh's garment industry was sort of famous worldwide. It sort of fueled a lot of the merchandise in many of the brands we know, H&M, Zara, Gap. And so was seen as a very crucial part of the global supply chains when it came to textiles and garments. But after COVID, you saw a severe unemployment crisis happening, especially amongst young people in Bangladesh. So you have 18 million young people who were not working, who were not in school. You had extremely high inflation, and all of these issues combined, exacerbated after the pandemic, meant that the youth saw this issue of employment quotas as a huge trigger point. And it was actually an expansion of these quota policies that led them out on the streets to begin with.
And what exactly is that quota system?
It's often known as reservations or quotas in South Asia. And so they already had a set of reservations in government jobs for certain demographics of people. And it was going to be expanded even further to include the relatives, the descendants of those who had fought for Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan in 1971. And that expansion is what really triggered a lot of the students, because if you can imagine an ecosystem where there's anyway not enough jobs for people, government jobs become even more coveted. They are already coveted in South Asia, but as the employment pot sort of shrinks, then these jobs become even more important for young people. So to see those jobs being increasingly reserved for certain segments of the population was a huge trigger point for them.
So how did things start to escalate in the last few weeks?
So initially, it was the response of Hasina and Hasina's police cracking down against these students, killing hundreds, that actually escalated it even further, backfired really badly against her, because the protests had just gone way beyond that policy, and they were now about Hasina. And I think that's the moment where you saw all that pent-up anger that I had described sort of culminated into this issue. It really was about her entire authoritarian rule and the lack of democracy in the country. And those clashes between police and students just continued to escalate. But the students kept coming back on the streets. Thousands of students and then increasingly non-students were coming out in Dhaka. And Hasina did not want to back down. And she, in fact, called the protesters this specific word that refers to those who helped the Pakistanis during Bangladesh's fight for independence, which is an extremely sensitive nerve to touch in Bangladeshi history. So the word razakar, the word's actual translation doesn't carry any of the meaning of what the word is. So the actual translation is volunteers. I think the connotation of the word feels more like the word traitors, and those who helped the Pakistani military massacre the Bengalis during their independence movement. It angered the students even more, and they did what protesters often do. They took the word, they co-opted it, made it their own, brought it into the protest, and just came out even more after that. And all of this built up over time and then crescendoed with thousands of people swarming into the prime minister's residence and the parliament. And we saw these crazy social media videos of, people sleeping in beds in her residence, carrying out crazy objects like buckets and saris and air coolers. And in Parliament, they were taking selfies, climbing all over the seats. And we had eyes on the ground who were telling us, people were taking showers in the Parliament. I mean, it was insane to believe that this had happened.
What was your reaction to seeing all of this unfold? And I have to imagine that some people, watching these videos of these protesters, what they were doing, how they were ransacking this leader's house, I'm sure some people were excited, but I also imagine a lot of people were horrified seeing that.
I think that describes a lot of what's happened in Bangladesh, not just this moment, but in general. I think I've talked to a lot of people who have been horrified, and I've talked to a lot of people who have been so inspired. And I think it's depends on who's watching these scenes.
So what was that moment when Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina decided that she was done? I mean, did she formally announce her resignation? Did she just disappear?
What we hear happened is that Hasina's sister was initially the one trying to convince her to leave, that, you cannot shoot at these people. We've also heard that the army themselves said, we're unwilling to shoot anymore at our own countrymen. And it wasn't until Hasina's son called her on the phone and tried to convince her that, you have to leave, your life is in danger. And that is when she left. Some of the details got a little bit murky in the days after, where all of a sudden Hasina's son was saying that she hasn't actually signed resignation papers. But by that point, the parliament had dissolved and the army and other forces had met with the students, and they had decided to form an interim government. The army announced that and then met with the students and the other forces, the Air Force and the Navy, met with the students and had a very long, I think it lasted 6 hours that day. We were all waiting to hear something.
I'm just imagining this scene and how absurd it must have felt, maybe even to people who were there and certainly to other people, watching from afar, seeing this all play out. I'm imagining the military and military officials sitting around this table negotiating with a bunch of 19-year-olds in T-shirts. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what it was like, but it does say something about how remarkable the situation is that you have the military essentially looking to these students as the deciders of okay, well, who do you guys want to be leading this country going forward?
Yeah, no, I do think it's quite remarkable. I think it's quite remarkable given the history of Bangladesh also, where the army there is a history of coups. There was fear at the moment that the army was going to sort of take over, but the students were just very, very powerful in this moment and continued to be powerful after. They did the same amassing around a place at the High Court and got the Chief Justice to resign. So I had many moments of this feeling throughout this reporting of how remarkable and unprecedented to my eyes it is to see students negotiating with the army to decide the leader of their country. And I do think it was probably kind of something like that, these 19, 20, 21-year-olds sitting around with the army and saying very adamantly, this is who we want as our leader.
After the break, who the students picked to lead the interim government, and what the next weeks and months could look like as they push for lasting change. We'll be right back. So, Karishma, you are describing how these students got together with the Bangladeshi military to decide on who would lead this new interim government. Who did they pick and why?
Yeah, so the students picked Muhammad Yunus. Muhammad Yunus is a Nobel laureate economist. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006.
Grameen Bank and I are deeply honored to receive this most prestigious of all awards. Since the Nobel Peace Prize,
and he's the pioneer of this concept of microfinance, this idea of microloans that is said to have lifted millions out of poverty.
For building stable peace, we must find ways to provide opportunities for people to live decent lives. The creation of opportunities for the majority of the people, the poor, is at the heart of the work that we have dedicated ourselves during the past 30 years.
Yeah, when I was reading your story, that's the one name that stuck out to me where I was like, oh, I actually have heard of Muhammad Yunus, that he, as you say, that people talked about him as like the father of microfinancing and this idea of, you can give small loans to people in the developing world and that can change the future. And he's kind of like this, I don't know, international like NGO darling of, of this guy who has a lot of money and is going out to help save the world.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why the students also liked him, is he has international recognition. He's sort of seen as this leader across the world. And so he has this legitimacy about him that I think students also were hooked onto. And Yunus also has this interesting sort of internal dynamic within Bangladesh, which is that Hasina hated this guy. And threw more than 100 lawsuits at him, money laundering, labor law violations. She once said that he, quote, sucked the blood from the poor. And he's had a very dominant role in Bangladeshi politics. He once tried to float a political party. So he's had sort of an esteemed presence in Bangladeshi history as well. Of course, like anyone, he does not have a foolproof reputation. There are people who do disagree with some things of what he's done, but the students felt that he was the most esteemed and the most reputable leader that they could pick in this moment. And then with Yunus, they sat down and picked the other advisors for the government, for the other ministries as well.
So how is this going to work going forward? Yunus is the head of this interim government, and then what do they do? What are they tasked with? Like, how long is this government going to be in place? And like, what's the process to getting to a permanent government?
That is exactly the question that is on everyone's minds and that nobody has an answer to. The students want much more major reform than just an election. A lot of them want a new constitution. And the students themselves are considering creating a new political party, or at least some new political party is being thought of in the works, because there's just such apathy and anger towards the two mainstream political parties in Bangladesh that there's this fear that if they have another election in just another 3 months, it's just going to lead to the same cycles that they've seen before, where another authoritarian government and both the parties, to many of these students, look exactly the same.
So I know that you managed to speak with some of the members of this new provisional government. Who did you talk to and what did you learn from them?
So we spoke to several people. One of them was Sharmeen Murshid, who is now the advisor for the Social Affairs Ministry, the equivalent of the minister.
I think we're we're in a daze. It's almost surreal. Even
I met her at her home, and she was sort of, I think, still in this moment of complete disbelief, of feeling that, just a week ago, she never would have imagined that she would have been a minister in the Bangladeshi government. She used to head a human rights nonprofit. And one of the things that nonprofit focused on was election monitoring. And so she was sort of seen as this like election watchdog, was a close sort of colleague and ally with Professor Yunus, and probably was chosen because of the social impact that she's had on the ground and her sort of grassroots level work.
What did she have to say about the task that she and her colleagues are up against and the fact that they were put in place with the trust of these students?
I think she had, as much of a cautious optimism as you can. She was very worried and concerned that she wouldn't live up to what the students were expecting of this new government.
So my fear is, lest we fail them. We dare not. We dare not fail. Because this is one movement that's not going to happen again.
She definitely had this fear of not wanting to fail them. She felt very heavily this weight of the immediate task in hand, which was to sort of get the law and order together, to get the cops back out on the streets. But then she also felt the weight of these longer term changes that the students wanted to see.
We have the whole country behind this. And what are we saying? What's the message that's going out from us? You can't do business as before. This is not business as usual. We are not a government that's come through business as usual process.
And so I think she was both, she was sort of exiting out of the disbelief phase and entering into the, okay, now I'm here, I'm sitting in government, I'm sitting in a powerful position that I never thought I would be in. And it's on my shoulders and the shoulders of these, more than a dozen other advisors to potentially get this country out of the cycles of coups and dictatorships and mainstream politics that it's seen again and again and again. So that weight, I think, was very clearly something she felt.
Yeah, I'm curious what this all means for people in Bangladesh who may not have necessarily supported the protests or either were affiliated with or supporters of Sheikh Hasina. I mean, for folks who were not at the helm of all this, what does this moment of uncertainty mean for them?
Yeah, so it is true that there is a strong feeling of revenge and anger against those who were associated with Hasina and her political party, the Awami League. And that does make people fearful that this could end up again in those cycles of violence that Bangladesh has seen. And Hasina was also was seen as a secular leader. She was seen to be against the Islamist extremists in the country. And so the Hindus, minority in the country, often supported her. So that has added another layer to this, which is the attacks against Hindus have also been wrapped into a larger conversation of the feeling of revenge against those who were associated with Hasina. I will say that a lot of misinformation has also been spread about attacks against Hindus. And there was a lot of fake videos or old videos being shared as if it was, happening in this moment. And so it's quite hazy to understand actually religiously what's happening on the ground right now.
So, Karishma, as you continue to cover all of this and wait to see if there are elections, when those elections happen, what are the questions that you have about how this is playing out, and what are you going to be keeping your eye on?
Yeah, so I think definitely is, like you said, when are the elections? How long does this government last? Another one is, what sort of reforms do they institute? To me, I'm curious if those reforms are focused on specific people, getting the chief justice out, getting the governor of the central bank out, getting the vice chancellors out, Or is it about systematic changes, institutional changes that ensure that, no matter who is at the helm of these institutions, they're able to be held accountable? So I'm curious what type of reform they hope to institute. I am curious of how much more violence do we see in the coming weeks, if the violence continues to sort of taper out. I'm curious about the potential for a new political party in Bangladesh. I'm really curious to see if these students, some of the older ones, can get to come together and if they build a political party and how that would change Bangladeshi society.
Karishma, thank you so much for having this conversation and explaining all of this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Karishma Mehrotra is a South Asia correspondent for The Post. Before you go, here are a couple other stories I'm keeping an eye on. The Federal Trade Commission's long push to ban non-compete agreements just hit a wall. Non-competes are contracts that restrict a worker's ability to switch employers within their industry. An estimated 30 million people are bound by these contracts, roughly 1 in 5 U.S. workers. The FTC's ban on non-competes was set to take effect in September, but yesterday, a federal judge in Texas struck it down, saying the FTC lacked the power to stop these agreements.
At a basic level, these non-compete clauses really undermine people's economic liberty.
FTC Chair Lina Khan sat down with Post Reports in June to talk about the proposed ban. She told us that she thinks allowing employers to use non-compete agreements gives them way too much power.
We heard from everybody ranging from bartenders and hairdressers to veterinarians and healthcare workers and engineers, people across professions, across income levels who shared how these non-competes had been devastating for them.
The FTC is now saying it will consider appealing the federal judge's ruling. And an update from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Yeah! Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight to officially nominate Kamala Harris for president. Another round of shots. DNC, turn out for what?
At the second night of the DNC, rapper Lil Jon stole the show during the roll call. That's when delegates from each state officially cast their votes for the nominee.
We're not going back. VP Harris, coming to wall. VP Harris, giving a wall.
Then the Obamas took the stage.
I am feeling ready to go. Even if I am the only person stupid enough to speak after Michelle Obama. I am feeling hopeful because this convention has always been pretty good to kids with funny names who believe in a country where anything is possible.
Tonight, we'll hear from former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz. We at The Post have a lot of folks in Chicago covering all this, including from the opinion side. And on their podcast, Impromptu, you can hear our colleagues Dana Milbank, Jennifer Rubin, Jonathan Capehart, and Jim Garrity debate about how Harris and the Democrats are performing. And, as you can hear, they do not all agree.
So they're feeling great. And at this point, they should feel great because of the way Trump is running and the way she's running. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if she did an interview once or twice? Give me a... How dare we journalists expect her to do interviews? How dare we expect press conferences?
Why are you so self-centered?
Journalists against journalism. Journalists against journalism.
You are going to want to listen to the rest of that conversation. Find Impromptu wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Peter Bresnan with help from Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks to Anant Gupta and Rashad Ahmad. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.